The Redwater Incident, where documented truth is stranger than fiction. The recording crackles through decades of static. A man's voice, urgent but controlled, cuts through the white noise like a scalpel through silence. Control? I'm tracking an object over Redwater Lake. Altitude unknown. No transponder signature. It's not responding to signals. Wait, it's... The transmission dies. What follows is not silence, but something worse. A low rhythmic hum that shouldn't exist on that frequency. A sound that would later be described by Air Force technicians as impossible, as unnatural, as wrong. The recording was leaked in January of 2019, uploaded to an anonymous server at 3 a.m. by someone using the handle Sector 7 Archivist. Within 6 hours, federal servers flagged the file. Within 12, it was scrubbed from every major platform. Within 24, the original uploader's account ceased to exist. But the internet remembers. Screenshots survived. Audio clips were downloaded and re-uploaded across a dozen platforms. And slowly, reluctantly, people began asking the question that officials had spent years trying to bury. What happened that night over Redwater Lake? This is that story. A story built not from speculation or conspiracy theory, but from dispatch logs, FOIA requests, eyewitness testimony, and documents that were never meant to see daylight. A story about the night something crossed into restricted airspace and changed the lives of everyone who saw it. This is the Redwater Incident. Part 1. The town. That time forgot Redwater. Montana exists in that liminal space between civilization and wilderness that defines so much of the American West. Population just under 2,000. One main street. 3 churches. A volunteer fire department that doubles as the social hub every Friday night. The kind of place where everyone knows your name, your business, and probably your grandfather's middle name. The town sits in a valley carved by glaciers millennia ago, surrounded by dense pine forest that stretches for miles in every direction. Redwater Lake itself is a cold, deep body of water fed by underground springs. Local legend says the lake has no bottom. Geologists say it reaches depths of over 400 feet in some places. Both might be right. What most residents don't know, or perhaps choose not to think about, is that Redwater sits less than 30 miles from a decommissioned Air Force radar installation. Built during the height of the Cold War as part of the Malmstrom Air Force Base radar chain, the station was designed to detect Soviet bombers crossing over the Canadian border. It was state-of-the-art in 1963. By 1991, with the Soviet Union collapsing and satellite technology rendering ground radar increasingly obsolete, it was mothballed. The towers still stand, rusting monuments to a war that never quite happened. Chain-link fences sag under their own weight. Warning signs fade in the mountain sun, but the concrete bunkers remain, sealed and forgotten, their purpose served and their secrets buried under layers of bureaucratic amnesia. This is important context, because what happened in October of 2011 didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a place where the military had once watched the skies with paranoid intensity. It happened in a gap in coverage that shouldn't have existed. It happened in a corridor that some radar technicians, speaking only in whispers, and only after retirement, refer to as Sector 7H. It happened in Redwater. Part 2. October 14th. Daniel Holt was not the kind of man who believed in flying saucers. At 38 years old, he worked as a forestry surveyor, volunteered with the local fire department, and spent his evenings tinkering with amateur radio equipment in his basement. He was practical, methodical, the kind of person who fixed things with his hands and trusted what he could measure and prove. October 14th, 2011 was a Friday. Daniel had spent the day marking timber plots in the national forest northeast of town. The work was solitary and satisfying in the way that physical labour can be when you're good at it. By evening he was back home, showered, and heading out to meet his friend Megan Walsh at her cabin on the north shore of Redwater Lake. Megan was a photographer. She'd moved to Montana from Seattle 3 years earlier, chasing that particular brand of peace that only comes from isolation and natural beauty. Her cabin sat on 2 acres of lakefront property, accessible only by a winding dirt road that tested the suspension of even the most rugged trucks. She'd invited Daniel out to photograph the stars. The forecast called for clear skies and a new moon. Perfect conditions. They set up on her dock around 9:30. 2 camping chairs, a thermos of coffee, and Megan's camera mounted on a tripod, aimed at the slice of sky above the lake. They talked about nothing important. Work, weather, the upcoming election. Normal conversation between normal people on a normal night. At approximately 10:40, everything stopped being normal. Megan saw it first, a bright orange light, low on the horizon above the far shore of the lake. She pointed it out to Daniel, who initially dismissed it as a rescue flare. The Forestry Service conducted night operations sometimes, but as they watched, the light moved, not drifted, moved, with purpose and impossible precision. "It's going against the wind," Megan said, her voice tight with confusion. The wind that night was blowing east to west, strong enough to ripple the lake surface. The light was moving west to east, maintaining a perfectly straight trajectory. Daniel stood up. His first instinct was to rationalize. A drone, maybe. Some wealthy tourist flying a high-end model, but the light was too bright, too large, and as it drew closer, he realized it was completely silent. No engine noise, no rotor wash, nothing. The object stopped approximately 200 yards from the dock, hovering at what Daniel later estimated to be about 300 feet altitude. From that distance, he could make out details. The light wasn't coming from a single source, but seemed to emanate from the entire surface of a sphere roughly the size of a small car. The orange glow pulsed slightly, like a heartbeat, like something alive. Megan had her camera. She started shooting, her hands shaking so badly that Daniel had to help her steady the tripod. Through the viewfinder, she would later report, the object appeared to have texture. Not smooth metal, but something that looked almost organic. Segmented. Breathing. They watched for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 3 minutes. And then the object did something that, according to every principle of physics Daniel had ever learned, should have been impossible. It accelerated straight upward, not gradually, not with any visible means of propulsion. One moment it hung in the air like a suspended thought. The next, it was gone, leaving only a faint orange afterglow that dissipated within seconds. The silence that followed was absolute. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Daniel's hands were shaking. Megan was crying, though she wouldn't remember starting. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the lake, something had just violated every understanding they had about how the world worked. Part 3. The night explodes. Daniel wasn't the only one who saw it. At 10:47, the Redwater County Dispatch Center received its first call. An elderly farmer named Robert Hendricks reported a falling fireball that had stopped in mid-air above his property. Before the dispatcher could respond, 2 more calls came in, then 5, then a dozen. The descriptions varied in detail but aligned in essence. A bright orange sphere, silent movement, impossible acceleration, objects that defied the basic laws of motion and gravity. Deputy Marcus Webb was the first officer to respond. His dashcam footage, released years later through a Freedom of Information Act request, shows him driving along County Road 12 at 10:53. The road runs parallel to the southern shore of Redwater Lake. In the footage, visible above the tree line, a sphere of light rises slowly into frame. It hovers for approximately 4 seconds. Then the video feed corrupts, dissolving into static and geometric patterns that seem almost intentional in their complexity. When the footage resumes 3 seconds later, the light is gone. but Deputy Webb's voice can be heard on the audio track. "Dispatch, are you seeing this? Are you—" A pause, then barely audible. "What the hell was that?" The dispatcher asks him to clarify. Webb doesn't respond immediately. When he does, his voice has changed. Flatter, more controlled. False alarm, just some atmospheric phenomenon, continuing, patrol. That wasn't what he saw. We know this because Deputy Webb's personal notebook, obtained years later by researchers, contains an entry from that night. The handwriting is shaky, almost illegible in places. Orange sphere, no sound, radio interference, could hear humming through closed windows, felt like pressure in my chest, like being watched. Need to report this. Need to... The entry stops mid-sentence. Deputy Webb never filed an official report about what he saw. When contacted by researchers in 2017, he declined to comment, saying only that he'd been advised not to discuss operational matters from that time period. When pressed on who had advised him, he ended the interview. But the dispatch logs don't lie. Between 10:40 and 11:15 on October 14, 2011, Redwater County Emergency Services received 37 calls reporting unusual aerial phenomena. By the following morning, the official record showed only 3 calls, all classified as meteor sightings. Someone had gone into the system and edited history. Part 4. The morning after the Redwater Register, the town's weekly newspaper ran a story on October 18th. The headline read, "Meteor startles Redwater residents." The article was brief, a few paragraphs describing bright lights in the sky, attributing them to meteor activity, and quoting County Administrator Helen Pierce saying that astronomical events can be startling but pose no danger to residents. It was a nothing story, a footnote, exactly what you'd expect from a small town paper covering a minor oddity. Except for one problem. The University of Montana's Department of Astronomy, when contacted by a curious researcher 6 months later, confirmed that there was no meteor activity recorded anywhere in the state on October 14th, 2011. The nearest documented meteor event was 3 weeks earlier, over 200 miles south. Daniel Holt read the article in disbelief. He'd seen what he'd seen. Megan had photographed it. Dozens of people had called it in. And now the official story was that they'd all mistaken a meteor for something that had hovered, moved against the wind and accelerated in ways that violated basic physics. He decided to do something about it. Daniel's amateur radio equipment was sophisticated. He'd recorded the audio frequencies from that night, capturing several minutes of interference that coincided with the sighting. The recordings contained that same low, rhythmic hum that appeared on Deputy Webb's dash cam audio, a frequency that shouldn't exist on civilian bands, a pattern that sounded less like static and more like communication. He uploaded the files to Above Top Secret, a popular forum dedicated to UFO research and government conspiracy theories. The post included his testimony, Megan's photographs, and the audio recordings. He titled it simply, "Redwater, Montana, October 14th. Multiple witnesses. This is real." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, his post had hundreds of replies. People shared similar stories from across the northwestern United States. Researchers began compiling data. The Redwater Incident, previously unknown, started to gain traction as a legitimate unexplained event. Then, 4 days later, Daniel's account was suspended. The post was deleted. The audio files vanished from the server. When he tried to access his backup files on his laptop, he found they'd been corrupted beyond recovery. Sophisticated data recovery software couldn't even find traces of them. It was, as one digital forensics expert would later describe it, a military-grade scrub. Part 5. The Visitors. 2 weeks after the incident, Daniel was in his garage rebuilding a carburetor on his truck when a sedan pulled into his driveway. 2 men emerged, both wearing dark suits that looked expensive and out of place in rural Montana. They carried briefcases and federal identification. "Mr. Holt, we're from the Air Safety Division. We need to talk to you about your radio equipment." Daniel had worked around enough bureaucrats to know when something felt wrong. These men had the bearing of federal agents, but their identification seemed off. The seals looked right, but the agency name, Air Safety Division, didn't match anything he recognised from the FAA's organisational structure. Still, they were polite, professional. They explained that there had been reports of unauthorised radio transmissions interfering with civilian and military communications. They had reason to believe his equipment might be contributing to the problem. They needed to confiscate his receivers for calibration and testing. It would only take a few weeks. He'd get everything back. Daniel asked to see a warrant. The men exchanged glances. Then the taller one smiled. "This isn't a criminal matter, Mr. Holt. This is about air safety, national security. We can get a warrant if you'd prefer, but that would involve local law enforcement, a lot of paperwork, and potentially some uncomfortable questions about what you've been broadcasting. Or you can cooperate, and we can all go home by lunchtime." The implication was clear. Make this difficult, and things would get more difficult for him. Daniel cooperated. He watched as they loaded his entire radio setup into their sedan. Thousands of dollars in equipment. Years of work. Gone in 15 minutes. As they prepared to leave, Daniel asked a question that had been bothering him. "What exactly is the Air Safety Division?" The shorter man closed the trunk and turned to face him. His expression was neutral, but his eyes were cold. "We're the people who make sure incidents don't become situations, Mr. Holt. Have a good day." They drove away, leaving Daniel standing in his driveway, wondering what he'd just experienced. Later that day, he tried to find information about the Air Safety Division, online. The search returned nothing. No official websites, no organisational charts, no budget documents, no press releases. According to every public record he could access, the Air Safety Division did not exist. He never got his equipment back. Part 6. The Pattern. In isolation, the Redwater Incident might have remained what skeptics wanted it to be. A misidentified natural phenomenon, mass hysteria, or elaborate hoax. But FOIA requests filed by researchers between 2015 and 2018 revealed something troubling. Redwater wasn't unique. In August of 2004, residents of Bonners Ferry, Idaho reported a stationary orange sphere hovering above Lake Pendorail. The object remained visible for approximately 20 minutes before ascending rapidly and disappearing. Local Air Force radar detected an unidentified contact that night, but classified it as atmospheric anomaly. In September of 1998, farmers near the Alberta border in Montana reported livestock deaths, coinciding with sightings of descending lights and reports of electrical interference. Autopsies on the dead cattle showed signs of exposure to high levels of electromagnetic radiation, though the source was never determined. In March of 2007, commercial pilots flying over northern Idaho reported a near miss with an unidentified object described as spherical orange, moving at impossible speeds. The FAA investigated but found insufficient evidence to determine the nature of the reported object. When plotted on a map, these incidents formed a distinct pattern. A corridor running roughly northwest to southeast, following the spine of the Rocky Mountains along the Idaho-Montana border. Every incident occurred within a 100-mile stretch. Every incident involved similar descriptions, and every incident was officially dismissed or explained away. Radar technicians who worked the early warning systems during the Cold War had a name for this area, Sector 7H. It represented a gap in coverage, a blind spot created by the topology of the mountains and the placement of radar installations. In theory, anything flying below a certain altitude and within a specific corridor could enter North American airspace undetected. In practice, that shouldn't have mattered. The Cold War was over. The Soviet Union had collapsed. Who would bother exploiting a gap in radar coverage in one of the most remote parts of the continental United States? Unless someone knew. Unless someone had been using that corridor for years. Unless Sector 7H was exactly where you'd want to go if you needed to enter North American airspace without being seen. Part 7. The Return. Daniel Holt tried to move on. He bought new radio equipment. He returned to work. He told himself that what he'd seen had an explanation, even if he didn't know what it was. He told himself that the men who'd taken his equipment were exactly what they claimed to be, even though he knew that was a lie. But some things don't let go. In March of 2013, a small YouTube channel dedicated to paranormal investigation contacted Daniel. They wanted to do a follow-up piece on the Redwater Incident, interview witnesses, revisit the location, try to capture evidence. Daniel was reluctant, but Megan convinced him. Maybe going back would provide closure. Maybe they'd seen nothing, and that would be its own kind of answer. They returned to her cabin on the night of March 9th. Clear skies, new moon, the same conditions as 2 years earlier. The YouTube crew set up cameras around the property. Daniel brought a new radio receiver, smaller and less sophisticated than his old setup, but functional. For 3 hours, nothing happened. They talked, told stories. The crew filmed B-roll of the lake and forest. It felt anticlimactic, exactly like returning to the scene of a dream and finding only ordinary reality. Then, at 11:37, Daniel's radio receiver registered interference, the same frequency, the same rhythmic pattern. That low, pulsing hum that bypassed thought and triggered something primal in the brain. Everyone felt it before they saw it. A pressure, a sense of being observed, and then silence. Complete silence. No wind, no insects, no birds. Even the lake seemed to stop moving, its surface becoming glass smooth in defiance of the breeze that had been blowing moments before. The object appeared over the eastern tree line. Orange sphere. Silent movement. Exactly as before, but this time they were ready. Multiple cameras tracked it. Daniel's receiver captured the interference. Megan photographed it with professional equipment. The YouTube crew filmed it in high definition. But something was different this time. As the object moved over the lake, its surface seemed to shift. Geometric patterns became visible within the glow. Triangular lattices rotating in impossible configurations. Mathematical precision that suggested purpose, intelligence, design. Daniel raised his camera to capture it. Through the viewfinder, the patterns seemed to intensify. Triangles within triangles, angles that hurt to look at, and then his camera died. Not gradually, not with the warning of a dying battery. One moment it was functioning perfectly. The next, the screen was black and the device was completely unresponsive. Around him, every electronic device was failing. The YouTube crew's cameras, Megan's equipment, cell phones. Even Daniel's wristwatch stopped, its digital display frozen at 11:43. The object hung in the air above them for what felt like an eternity. Then, as before, it accelerated upward and vanished. The silence lingered for several seconds. Then all at once the night sounds returned. Wind, insects, the lap of water against the dock, as if reality had paused and then resumed playing. Daniel looked at his watch. It now read 1:43 in the morning. 2 hours had passed. He had no memory of them. Part 8. The Evidence. When Daniel woke up the next morning, his left forearm burned. A patch of skin about 4 inches across had turned red and blistered, as if he had been exposed to intense heat or radiation. But he didn't remember burning himself, didn't remember pain during the incident, didn't remember those 2 missing hours at all. He drove to Kalispell, the nearest city with a hospital large enough to have specialists. The emergency room physician who examined him was puzzled. The burn pattern was consistent with radiation exposure. but the type and intensity didn't match any standard source. It wasn't sunburn, wasn't thermal, wasn't consistent with X-ray exposure. It looks like flashburn dermatitis, the physician told him, but I've only seen that in patients who've been exposed to nuclear testing or industrial radiation accidents. Have you been near any radioactive materials? Daniel said he hadn't. The physician prescribed antibiotics and pain medication and recommended follow-up with a dermatologist. Daniel left with more questions than answers and a medical record that would later become crucial evidence. The YouTube channel tried to upload their footage. Every file was corrupted, not just damaged, corrupted in ways that suggested deliberate interference. The video showed only static and those same geometric patterns that had been visible on the object itself. Audio contained nothing but that low-frequency hum. Even the backup files on separate storage devices were affected. Only one piece of evidence survived. A single frame from Megan's camera, captured in the moment before it died. The image shows the object clearly, its surface covered in those rotating triangular patterns. Enhancement reveals details that shouldn't be possible to photograph. Layers within layers. Depth that suggests the sphere isn't a solid object but a window into something else. Experts who've analysed the image can't agree on what it shows. Some claim it's been manipulated. Others argue that the geometric patterns represent mathematical constants found in quantum physics. A few, speaking only anonymously, suggest it shows technology that doesn't exist in any public database. But everyone agrees on one thing: the image is real. Whatever Megan photographed that night, it was there. It was physical. It was documented. Part 9. The Whistleblower. Harold Cook spent 33 years working radar systems for the United States Air Force. He'd tracked Soviet bombers during the Cold War, monitored the skies during the Gulf War, and watched the transition from analog to digital systems transform military aviation. He'd seen things that officially didn't exist and kept silent about them because that was what the job required. But retirement has a way of loosening tongues. In September of 2017, Harold contacted a researcher named Patricia Chambers, who ran a website dedicated to documenting UFO incidents. He claimed to have information about Redwater. He'd been stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base in 2011, working the radar systems that monitored airspace over Montana. He'd seen the original data from October 14th. They met at a diner in Great Falls. Harold was 73 years old, frail but sharp-eyed. He brought no documents, no physical evidence, just his testimony and a memory that had haunted him for 6 years. The object appeared on our screens at approximately 10:45, he told Patricia. Altitude reading showed 60,000 feet. Then, 3 seconds later, sea level. Then gone. Not moving, not descending, just phasing between altitudes like it was switching channels on a television. Patricia asked if that was possible. Harold laughed, but there was no humour in it. Under known physics? Absolutely not. An object can't teleport between altitudes. It can't ignore momentum or gravity. But that's what the data showed. The system logged it as a malfunction. The officer on duty ordered a diagnostic, and while we were running tests, the object reappeared. Same behaviour. Phasing. He described how the data was recorded, how multiple systems confirmed the readings, how there should have been a permanent record in the base's archives, and then he described what happened next. 2 days after the incident, new orders came down. All data from October 14th was to be pulled and delivered to a specific office. Not through normal channels, not with proper documentation, just pulled and handed over. Harold watched as every file, every backup, every record was removed from the system. He asked his commanding officer what was happening. The response was blunt. Nothing is happening. Nothing was recorded. This conversation isn't occurring. Harold kept his mouth shut for 6 years, but retirement meant he was beyond the reach of military discipline, beyond the threat of courts-martial or security clearances being revoked. He could finally speak. Patricia recorded the interview. She planned to publish it on her website, complete with Harold's full testimony, and corroborating details about Malmström's radar systems. The article was scheduled to go live on October 1st, 2017. On September 26th, Harold Cook died in what local police called a domestic accident. He apparently fell down the stairs in his home, striking his head on the concrete floor of his basement. He was found 2 days later by a neighbour who'd noticed his mail piling up. The investigation was brief. The coroner ruled accidental death. Case closed. Harold's laptop was never found. His personal notebooks, which his daughter claimed he kept meticulously organised in his study, had vanished. Patricia's recording of their interview was on a device stolen from her car 3 days after Harold's death. The article about Redwater was never published. Patricia shut down her website 6 months later, citing personal reasons. She's declined all interview requests since. Part 10. Official Acknowledgement. For years, the United States government maintained its official position on UFOs. They didn't exist. There was no evidence of extraterrestrial visitation, and all reported sightings could be explained through natural phenomena or misidentification. Then, in December of 2017, the New York Times published a bombshell story. The Pentagon had been running a secret program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or AATIP. The program's mandate was to investigate reports of unidentified aerial phenomena, the government's preferred term for what everyone else called UFOs. The revelation was stunning. Not because the government had investigated UFOs, skeptics had long assumed that, but because the program had concluded that some of these phenomena demonstrated flight characteristics that defied conventional explanation. Objects that accelerated without visible propulsion. Craft that made impossible turns at impossible speeds. Technology that seemed to violate the laws of physics as currently understood. In June of 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released a preliminary assessment of UAPs. The report analysed 144 incidents reported by military personnel between 2004 and 2021. Of those, all but one remained unexplained. The report was carefully worded, avoiding sensational language or definitive conclusions. But buried in the details, in the clinical language of government bureaucracy, was an acknowledgement that something was happening in American airspace, something real, something unidentified. And then, on page 8 of the unclassified version, appeared a heavily redacted paragraph. The visible text read, "Incident reference, Northern Continental Electromagnetic Disruption Event, date redacted, location redacted, multiple sensor confirmation, visual confirmation, data classified under redacted, no further information available at this classification level." Researchers immediately began trying to match the incident to known UAP cases. The timeline fit 2011. The location designation, Northern Continental, suggested Montana or Idaho. And the reference to electromagnetic disruption matched reports from Redwater. Freedom of Information Act requests seeking unredacted versions of the report were denied on national security grounds. Further inquiries were met with the standard response. No further information available. They'd admitted it happened. They just wouldn't say where, or what, or why. But for those who'd been following the Redwater incident, the implication was clear. The government knew. They'd always known. And they'd spent a decade trying to ensure no one else did. Part 11. The Theory. Professor Elaine Cooper spent 25 years studying plasma physics at MIT before retiring to a small research position at the University of Montana. She'd published extensively on electromagnetic field theory, plasma dynamics, and advanced propulsion concepts. She was, by any measure, one of the leading experts in her field. In 2019, a colleague sent her the surviving evidence from Redwater, the photographs, the medical reports, the radio recordings, the declassified ATIP documents. He asked if she could offer any explanation consistent with known physics. Professor Cooper spent 3 months analysing the data. Her conclusions, published in a small academic journal that specialised in fringe physics, were startling. The object described in the Redwater Incident, she argued, was almost certainly utilising a plasma magnetic propulsion field. Such a field would surround the craft in an ionised envelope, allowing it to manipulate electromagnetic forces for propulsion and potentially rendering it effectively invisible to conventional radar except under specific atmospheric conditions. The technology was theoretical but not impossible. Papers had been published on the concept since the 1960s. The problem was power generation. Creating a stable plasma field around a craft the size described in the Redwater reports would require energy outputs that exceeded anything currently available in portable form, unless someone had solved the power generation problem. Unless classified research had advanced far beyond what was publicly known. Unless, as some whispered, the technology hadn't been developed but recovered. Professor Cooper was careful in her conclusions. She didn't claim extraterrestrial origin. She didn't speculate about alien visitation. She simply presented the physics and noted that if such technology existed, it would explain everything observed at Redwater. But she did add one troubling note at the end of her paper. The observed behaviour patterns suggest intelligence and purpose. If this technology exists, someone built it, someone operates it, and if it's terrestrial in origin, we must ask why no agency or nation has claimed ownership. If it's non-terrestrial, we must ask why it chose Redwater, Montana as a point of contact. Either answer raises profound questions about what we think we know about our world and our place in it. Part 12. The Final Leak. December the 7th, 2022, 3 in the morning. A user with the handle Sector 7 Archivist posted to a private subreddit dedicated to UAP research. The post contained a single line of text and a file download link. Redwater. Complete documentation. Pass it on. The file was large, over 2 gigabytes. Researchers who downloaded it before the link was scrubbed found it contained dozens of documents. Radar data, dispatch logs, medical reports, photographs, audio recordings, even internal memos from agencies that officially denied any involvement with the incident. The crown jewel was a NORAD communication log from October 14th, 2011. The log showed multiple tracking stations detecting an unidentified object entering North American airspace from the northwest. The object was tracked across Montana for approximately 7 minutes before signal was lost. Visual confirmation was noted by multiple sources. One entry, timestamped at 22:47 Mountain Daylight Time, included a designation that would haunt researchers. Visual confirmed, lake intercept, non-ballistic trajectory, unknown origin, status, monitoring. Visual confirmed. 2 words that ended a decade of denial. Within 3 hours of the post going live, the subreddit was locked. The download link was dead. The user account for Sector 7 Archivist was deleted, along with all posting history. Reddit administrators, when questioned, claimed the content violated terms of service regarding classified information. But 2 researchers had downloaded the full archive. They verified the documents, cross-referenced them with known data, and concluded the leak was genuine. They attempted to share their findings through traditional media outlets. Every major news organisation declined to run the story, citing inability to verify authenticity or concerns about national security. The documents eventually made their way to smaller independent researchers and websites. They remain available if you know where to look, and they tell a story that the official narrative has spent years trying to suppress. Something came to Redwater on October 14th, 2011. It was real, it was documented, and it was covered up. Epilogue. What the sky remembers. Redwater Lake is quiet now. Tourists come in summer to fish and camp. Winter brings cross-country skiers and the occasional researcher looking for the cabin where it all happened. Megan sold the property in 2015 and moved back to Seattle. She doesn't give interviews. Daniel Holt still lives in town. He returned to forestry work, rebuilt his radio equipment, and tries not to think about those 2 missing hours. The burn scar on his forearm has faded but never entirely disappeared. On cold mornings, he says, he can still feel it. The old Air Force radar installation rusts in silence. The towers lean like accusing fingers pointing at a sky that keeps its secrets. Local teenagers sometimes break through the fencing to explore the abandoned bunkers, looking for Cold War artifacts and finding only darkness and decay. But on certain nights, when conditions are right, clear skies, new moon, that particular quality of stillness that settles over mountain lakes, people report seeing lights, orange spheres that move with impossible precision, objects that hover and accelerate in ways that physics says cannot happen. The reports are dismissed. Atmospheric phenomena, drones, satellites, mass hysteria. The usual explanations deployed to transform the inexplicable into the mundane. But the dispatch logs don't lie. The radiation burns don't lie. The documents leaked by Sector 7 archivists don't lie. And somewhere in a government database, classified under protocols that ensure it will never be freely accessed, sits the complete record of what happened that October night. Visual confirmed. 2 words that change everything. Because if Redwater was real, and all evidence suggests it was, then we must confront uncomfortable truths about what flies through our skies. We must ask whether the objects that have been reported for decades, dismissed as fantasy and delusion, might be something more. We must consider the possibility that we are not alone in watching the stars, or we must consider something perhaps more disturbing, that we are alone, but that someone on Earth has developed technology so advanced, so far beyond public knowledge, that it might as well be extraterrestrial. That somewhere, in laboratories funded by black budgets and shielded by classification levels most people will never know exist, humans have achieved what should be impossible. Either answer is troubling. Either answer suggests our understanding of the world is incomplete. Either answer demands questions that those in power seem determined not to answer. The recording that started this story, the transmission from October 14th, ends with that burst of static and the rhythmic hum that shouldn't exist. But if you listen carefully, if you isolate the frequencies and filter out the interference, you can hear something else beneath it. Breathing. Not mechanical, not electronic. Something organic, something alive. Or maybe that's just what we want to hear. Maybe the human mind is so desperate for meaning, so hungry for answers, that it creates patterns where none exist. Maybe Redwater was exactly what the skeptics say, a series of misidentifications, atmospheric anomalies, and coincidences compiled into a narrative by people who want to believe. Maybe. But on October 14th, 2023, exactly 12 years after the original incident, 3 hikers camping on the north shore of Redwater Lake reported seeing an orange sphere hovering above the water. They filmed it on their phones before the devices died. They described geometric patterns visible on its surface. They mentioned a period of missing time and complete silence. Their report was filed with the county sheriff's office. It was logged, acknowledged, and quietly archived. No investigation was conducted. No follow-up was made. It joined the long list of incidents that officially never happened. The sky above Redwater remembers. The lake holds its secrets. And somewhere in the darkness between stars and earth, something continues to watch, waiting, observing, for reasons we may never understand and purposes we can only fear to imagine. This is the Redwater Incident, a story built not from speculation, but from documents, testimony, and evidence that refuses to be silenced. A story about the night reality cracked and something impossible became undeniably real. Case status: unexplained. Data archived under FAA Incident 11-1097. No further comments, but the silence itself speaks volumes. And if you listen, really listen, You can still hear that hum, low and rhythmic, like a heartbeat from something that watches from above, something that came to Redwater once and maybe never left. The UFO that punched a hole in the sky above Chicago, November 7th, 2006. 4:14 in the afternoon. Gate C17, one of the busiest airports in the world. And then, without warning, time seemed to stop for a dozen trained aviation professionals who would never forget what they saw hanging in the sky above them. Introduction. The moment everything changed. November 7th. 2006 started like any other Tuesday at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The afternoon shift was in full swing. Mechanics crawled under aircraft bellies checking hydraulic lines. Ramp workers guided incoming flights with orange batons. Pilots reviewed flight plans in cockpits that smelled of coffee and aviation fuel. More than 200 aircraft were scheduled to move through O'Hare that afternoon, each one a carefully choreographed dance of metal, fuel, and human precision. The sky was overcast, a thick blanket of grey clouds sitting at about 1,800 feet. Perfect flying weather for commercial aviation. Terrible weather for what was about to happen. At 4:14 in the afternoon, a United Airlines mechanic named Thomas Wilkins was walking across the tarmac near Gate C17 when something made him stop. Later, he would struggle to explain what drew his attention upward. There was no sound, no flash of light, no warning whatsoever. But when he looked up, his world tilted on its axis. Hovering silently above Gate C17, approximately 1,500 feet in the air, was an object that should not have existed. It was a disc, perfectly round, metallic grey, and it was not moving. Wilkins had been working at O'Hare for 17 years. He had seen everything the sky could throw at an airport. Birds migrating in massive flocks that sometimes interfered with radar. Weather balloons drifting lazily through restricted airspace. Small private planes that wandered off course and caused brief moments of panic in the control tower. He had even seen a parachutist once, years ago, who had miscalculated his landing zone and nearly collided with the departing 737. But this was different. This was something else entirely. The object was positioned directly above Gate C17, one of the busiest gates at one of the busiest airports in the world. Below it, a United Airlines Boeing 757 was being prepared for departure to Los Angeles. Ground crew were loading luggage. Fuel trucks were disconnecting their hoses. Passengers were settling into their seats, stuffing carry-on bags into overhead compartments, completely unaware that something impossible was hovering 1,000 feet above their heads. The colour of the object was distinctive. Not silver like polished aluminum, not white like most aircraft. It was a dark metallic grey, almost gunmetal, with a matte finish that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. In the overcast afternoon light, it looked almost like a hole in the sky itself, a darker shape against the already grey clouds. Wilkins stood frozen, his clipboard hanging loose in his hand. Around him, the airport continued its mechanical symphony. Jet engines whined, ground crews shouted coordinates, luggage carts beeped in reverse. But above all of it, suspended in complete silence, was something that made every law of physics he understood seem suddenly negotiable. He grabbed the radio clipped to his belt. His voice cracked as he called it in. Within seconds, others were looking up. Within minutes, more than a dozen United Airlines employees, pilots, mechanics, gate agents and ground crew would become witnesses to something that would haunt them for years. Something that would force the Federal Aviation Administration to issue official statements. Something that would make headlines around the world for exactly one day before vanishing into the machinery of bureaucratic denial. This is the story of the O'Hare Incident. A story about trained professionals who saw something impossible. A story about an object that defied every known principle of flight, and a story about what happens when the unexplainable collides with an institution that cannot afford to acknowledge it. Act 1. The Witness Cascade. The first witness was Thomas Wilkins, but he would not be the last, not by a long shot. Within 3 minutes of Wilkins' initial sighting, 5 more ground crew members had stopped what they were doing and were staring upward. Then came the pilots. Captain Raymond Hollingsworth was in the cockpit of United Flight 893, preparing for departure to Denver when his first officer tapped his shoulder and pointed out the window. Hollingsworth was a 23-year veteran of commercial aviation. He had logged over 15,000 hours in the air. He had flown through hurricanes, electrical storms and equipment failures that would make passengers' blood freeze. He was not a man easily rattled, but when he looked out his cockpit window and saw what was hovering above gate C-17, his mouth went dry. The first thought that went through his mind was threat assessment. Was this object a danger to his aircraft, to his passengers, to the airport? He had been trained to identify threats, to categorize them, to respond appropriately. But this object did not fit into any category he knew. It was not moving toward them. It was not showing any hostile intent. It was just there, hanging in the air like someone had painted it onto the sky. His first officer, a younger pilot named Jennifer Nakamura, was equally transfixed. She had pulled out her phone and was trying to take a picture, but the angle from the cockpit window was poor, and the distance was too great. The image she captured would later show nothing more than a dark smudge against grey clouds. But both pilots knew what they were looking at was no smudge. It was solid. It was real. And it was unlike anything either of them had ever seen. The object was approximately 25 to 30 feet in diameter. That was the consensus among witnesses, though some estimates ran as high as 40 feet. It was disc-shaped, almost perfectly circular. The colour was consistent across every witness account. Dark metallic grey, like gunmetal or brushed steel. There were no visible seams, no rivets, no markings of any kind, no windows, no lights, no visible means of propulsion, and it was not moving. At all. This point cannot be overstated. The object was not drifting, it was not bobbing, it was not rotating. It hung in the air with the absolute stillness of something nailed to the sky itself. Pilots know what helicopters look like when they hover. They know what drones look like. They know what weather balloons look like. This was none of those things. Helicopters hover with a characteristic slight wobble, constantly making micro-adjustments to maintain position. Their rotor wash creates visible disturbances in the air below them, kicking up dust and debris on the ground. Drones, even large military drones, have visible propellers or rotors. Weather balloons drift with air currents, never maintaining a perfectly fixed position. This object exhibited none of these characteristics. It was as motionless as a building, except buildings do not float 1,500 feet in the air. The thickness of the disc was harder to judge from ground level, but witnesses estimated it to be somewhere between 3 and 6 feet at its thickest point. The edges appeared to be slightly thinner than the centre, giving it a classic flying saucer profile. Some witnesses described it as looking almost like 2 dinner plates pressed together rim to rim. Aviation mechanic David Schultz had worked at O'Hare for 11 years. He was standing near the de-icing station when the call came over the radio. He walked to a position where he could see gate C-17 and stopped dead in his tracks. Years later, in an interview with a Chicago television station, he would describe what he saw. The object looked solid, not translucent, not shimmering, solid. Like something you could reach out and touch if you could get close enough. It had depth, and dimension. It occupied space. Whatever it was physically there, hanging in restricted airspace above one of the busiest airports in the world. Schultz was trained in aircraft identification. Part of his job involved recognising different types of aircraft from a distance, understanding their capabilities and limitations. He could identify a Boeing 747 from a 757 at a glance. He could tell the difference between an Airbus A320 and a Boeing 737 from their silhouettes. But this object matched no silhouette he had ever seen in any manual, any training session, or any experience in his 11 years at O'Hare. The surface of the disc appeared to be seamless. In modern aircraft manufacturing, you can always see the panels, the access hatches, the joints where different sections of the fuselage come together. This object had none of that. It looked as if it had been formed from a single piece of material, whatever that material was. The matte grey finish gave it an almost organic quality, as if it had grown rather than been built. Gate Supervisor Janet Thornton was inside the terminal when the first report started coming in. She walked outside onto the observation deck and immediately saw it. Her first thought was that it was some kind of advertising stunt. Her second thought was that whoever authorised this stunt was going to lose their job. Her third thought was that it was not a stunt. Nothing about it made sense as a stunt. Thornton had been a gate supervisor for 9 years. She had seen her share of unusual incidents. Celebrities trying to board planes without proper identification. Passengers attempting to smuggle exotic pets in carry-on luggage. Emergency landings that filled the terminal with the smell of burnt rubber. But she had never seen anything like this. She pulled out her radio and tried to get clarification from the control tower. The response was confused and unhelpful. Yes, they were aware of something over gate C-17. No, they did not know what it was. No, it was not showing up on radar. How could something that large not show up on radar? Thornton stared at the object, trying to make sense of it. The airport's radar systems were sophisticated enough to track birds. They could detect turbulence. They could identify incoming storms. But this metallic disc, this object large enough to be visible from the ground with the naked eye, was apparently invisible to their most advanced detection equipment. A passenger tapped her on the shoulder. The woman was elderly, probably in her 70s, and she was pointing at the sky. "Do you see that?" she asked. Thornton nodded. The passenger asked if it was a new type of aircraft. Thornton did not know what to say. She settled for a non-committal response about checking with operations, but inside she was as confused and unsettled as anyone else watching the impossible object hanging in the sky. By 4:20 in the afternoon, at least 12 United Airlines employees had confirmed visual contact with the object. They were not all standing in the same place. They were scattered across different areas of the airport, different vantage points, different angles, but they were all looking at the same thing, a metallic disc hovering silently above gate C-17. Someone contacted the control tower. The tower confirmed that they were not tracking anything unusual on radar. The object was either invisible to radar or too small to register, though neither explanation made sense given its reported size and metallic composition. Someone else contacted the Federal Aviation Administration. The FAA's initial response was dismissive. They suggested it was likely a weather balloon or a small private aircraft. But the witnesses knew what they were seeing was neither of those things. And then, at approximately 4:28 in the afternoon, the object moved. It did not fly away, it did not drift, it did not bank or turn or accelerate gradually like any known aircraft would do. What it did was something that would be corroborated by every single witness who saw it happen. Something that would become the defining characteristic of the O'Hare incident. The disc shot straight up, instantaneously, vertically, with no visible acceleration phase. One moment it was hovering motionless. The next moment it was gone, punching through the cloud layer at a speed that no one could accurately estimate, because it happened too fast for the human eye to track. Several witnesses would later describe a sense of disorientation in that moment. The human brain is designed to track moving objects. We can follow a baseball through the air. We can watch a jet accelerate down a runway. We understand motion as a continuous process. But what happened at O'Hare that afternoon violated that understanding. The object did not move through space in any conventional sense. It was simply in one location, and then it was in another location, with no perceptible transition between the two states. And where it had been, where it had torn through the clouds, there was now a hole. A perfectly circular hole in the overcast sky. Clean edges, geometric precision, like someone had taken a giant hole punch and cut a perfect circle out of the cloud layer. The hole stayed there for several minutes, clearly visible to everyone watching, before the clouds slowly began to fill it in. The size of the hole matched the diameter of the object almost exactly. Witnesses estimated it to be between 25 and 35 feet across. The edges were sharp and defined, not fuzzy or indistinct like you would expect from a natural cloud formation. It looked artificial, deliberate, as if the object had carved its exit path through the cloud layer with surgical precision. Thomas Wilkins stood on the tarmac, staring up at the hole. Around him, the normal sounds of airport operations were slowly resuming. Jet engines, hydraulic lifts, the beeping of reversing vehicles. But for a few moments, everything had stopped. Everyone who had seen the object depart was standing in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Pilots who had seen it happen were standing on the tarmac in stunned silence. Ground crew members were looking at each other, trying to find words for what they had just witnessed. Gate agents inside the terminal were pressing their faces against windows, searching the sky for any sign of the object that had just defied every principle of aerodynamics they had ever learned. Thomas Wilkins, the mechanic who had first spotted the object, was still standing near Gate C-17. He looked at the hole in the clouds. Then he looked at his clipboard. Then he looked back at the hole. His hands were shaking. The O'Hare incident had lasted approximately 14 minutes. 14 minutes that would change the lives of everyone who witnessed it. 14 minutes that would raise questions that would never be adequately answered. Act 2. Whistleblowers break protocol. The moment the object disappeared, the machinery of institutional control began to grind into motion. United Airlines management moved quickly. Within an hour of the sighting, employees were being told not to speak to anyone about what they had seen. No media, no family members, no one outside the company. The official position was that the matter was under investigation and that any public statements would jeopardize that investigation. For most of the witnesses, this directive created an impossible situation. They had just seen something extraordinary, something that challenged their understanding of what was possible, and now they were being told to stay silent about it. Some complied, others did not. The gag order felt wrong to many of the witnesses. They were not military personnel dealing with classified information. They were civilian employees who had witnessed something in public airspace at a civilian airport. What possible justification could there be for silencing them? The official answer was liability. The unofficial truth was more complicated. United Airlines did not want the publicity. They did not want passengers asking questions. They did not want reporters swarming the airport. And most of all, they did not want to acknowledge that something unexplained had been hovering over one of their gates for 14 minutes, while the company's security and management did nothing about it. But silence is difficult to maintain when a dozen people know the same secret. And when one of those people decided to reach out to the media, the entire carefully constructed wall of denial began to crack. On November the 8th, the day after the incident, Chicago Tribune reporter John Hilkovich received an anonymous tip. Someone from United Airlines wanted to talk. Someone who had been there. Someone who had seen it. Hilkovich was an experienced aviation reporter. He had covered O'Hare for years. He knew how airports worked. He knew the culture of aviation, the protocols, the chain of command. He also knew that when multiple employees from a major airline risk their careers to go on record about something, it is worth investigating. The first meeting took place in a parking lot 3 miles from the airport. The witness was nervous, constantly checking over their shoulder, speaking in hushed tones despite the fact that they were alone. The story that emerged was consistent with what Hilkovich would hear from other witnesses in the days that followed. A metallic disc, no sound, no visible propulsion, hovering motionless for approximately 14 minutes, and then, the instantaneous vertical departure that left a hole in the clouds. Hilkovic took notes. He asked clarifying questions. He pressed for details that could be independently verified. The witness was remarkably precise. Times, locations, weather conditions, the position of the sun, the flight that was being loaded at Gate C-17, every detail checked out. This was not someone spinning a fantasy. This was someone describing what they had actually seen. The first witness he spoke with was a United Airlines pilot who insisted on anonymity. The pilot's description was precise and technical. The object was disc-shaped, metallic, approximately 30 feet in diameter. It showed no visible means of propulsion. It made no sound. It did not drift or rotate. And when it departed, it shot straight up through the clouds so fast that it left a visible hole that persisted for several minutes. Hilkovic pressed for details. How fast did it move? The pilot struggled to quantify it. Faster than anything I have ever seen, he said. Jets accelerate, missiles accelerate. This thing did not accelerate. It was stationary and then it was gone. There was no in-between. A second witness came forward, a ground crew supervisor, then a third, a mechanic. Each one corroborated the same basic facts. Each one risked disciplinary action or termination by speaking out. Each one felt compelled to do it anyway. One pilot, speaking on condition of anonymity, told Hilkovic something that would become one of the most quoted lines from the entire incident. It was a perfect disc, the pilot said. It did not fly away. It shot straight up. It cut a hole in the clouds. Clean. Like something solid punching through tissue paper. The story broke on January 1st, 2007. Nearly 2 months after the actual incident. The Chicago Tribune ran it as a front-page story. The headline read, "Officials investigating UFO sighting at O'Hare." Within hours, the story had been picked up by national media. CNN ran it. CBS News covered it. For one day, the O'Hare incident was the biggest story in America. The timing of the story's publication was deliberate. Hilkovic had spent nearly 2 months investigating, verifying witness accounts, and attempting to get official responses from United Airlines and the FAA. Both organisations had stonewalled him. United claimed they had no knowledge of any incident. The FAA claimed they had no record of any unusual activity at O'Hare on November 7th. It was only when Hilkovic informed them that he had multiple named sources willing to go on record that the official position began to shift. The FAA was forced to respond. Their initial statement was brief and dismissive. The agency said it had no record of the incident, no radar data, no official reports. As far as the FAA was concerned, nothing had happened at O'Hare on November 7th, 2006. But the witnesses would not go away. More employees came forward, more details emerged, the pressure mounted. And finally, reluctantly, the FAA issued a second statement. This time they acknowledged that something had been reported, but they attributed it to weather phenomena. Specifically, they claimed that a hole punch cloud, a legitimate meteorological phenomenon, had been observed over O'Hare that afternoon. The problem with this explanation was that it made no sense. Hole punch clouds occur at high altitude when supercooled water droplets freeze and fall, creating a circular gap in the cloud layer. They do not occur at 1,800 feet. They are not caused by disc-shaped metallic objects hovering in place and then shooting upward at impossible speeds. And they certainly are not witnessed by a dozen trained aviation professionals who all describe the same thing. The explanation was so transparently inadequate that it actually drew more attention to the incident. Aviation forums exploded with discussion. Pilots from around the country weighed in, many pointing out the obvious flaws in the FAA's weather theory. Meteorologists were contacted for comment. Several pointed out that hole punch clouds typically occur in cirrocumulus or altocumulus cloud layers, not the stratus layer reported at O'Hare that day. Others noted that hole punch clouds form gradually over several minutes or longer. They do not appear instantaneously when an object shoots upward through the cloud deck. The credibility of the witnesses became a central issue. Were these people reliable? Were they trained observers? Could they be trusted? The answer, by any objective measure, was yes. These were not random civilians looking up at the sky. These were aviation professionals, pilots with thousands of flight hours, mechanics who had spent careers working on aircraft, air traffic controllers who spent their days identifying and tracking objects in the sky. If anyone could be trusted to accurately describe what they had seen, it was these individuals. But the FAA held to its explanation. Weather phenomena, case closed. No further investigation was warranted. The object that a dozen people had seen hovering silently above one of the busiest airports in the world was officially nothing more than an unusual cloud formation. The witnesses were outraged. Some spoke to the media again, this time more forcefully. They knew what they had seen. It was not a cloud. It was not a weather balloon. It was not a drone. It was something solid and metallic and completely outside their frame of reference. Thomas Wilkins, the mechanic who had first spotted the object, gave an interview to a local television station. His frustration was evident. "I know what I saw," he said. "We all know what we saw. And it was not weather. It was a craft, something that flew, something that should not have been there." But by then, the media had moved on. The story had run its 24-hour cycle. There were other headlines, other crises, other distractions. The O'Hare incident faded from the front page, then from the news entirely, and the witnesses were left with their memories and their unanswered questions. Act 3. The cover up begins. The official silence surrounding the O'Hare incident might have been the end of the story, except for one thing. Someone filed a Freedom of Information Act request. FOA requests are the bureaucratic equivalent of shining a flashlight into dark corners. They force government agencies to release documents and records that would otherwise remain hidden. In the case of the O'Hare incident, the FOA request demanded all records related to the November 7th sighting, including radar data, tower recordings, and any internal communications about the event. The FAA fought the request. They claimed there were no relevant records. They claimed that no official incident had occurred. They claimed that releasing any information would compromise security protocols. But under FOA law, these objections carried limited weight. Eventually, after months of legal wrangling, the FAA was forced to release a limited set of documents. What those documents revealed was startling. First, there were the tower recordings. Multiple FAA personnel could be heard discussing the incident as it was happening. Controllers mentioned that United Airlines employees were reporting an object over Gate C-17. There was confusion about what it was. There was discussion about whether to alert other aircraft in the area. And there was clear evidence that the incident had been taken seriously in real time, even if the official position later claimed otherwise. One particularly revealing exchange went like this. A controller asked if anyone had visual confirmation. Another voice responded that multiple ground personnel had confirmed seeing something. The third voice asked if it was on radar. The response was negative, no radar contact, which raised an obvious question that no one on the recording seemed willing to address out loud. How can something solid enough to be seen by a dozen people be invisible to radar? The tone of the controllers was professional, but clearly concerned. These were people who dealt with air traffic every day, who were trained to handle emergencies, who understood the systems they were working with, and they were encountering something that did not fit into any of their protocols or procedures. You could hear the uncertainty in their voices, the pauses before responses, the careful choice of words. They knew they were dealing with something unusual, and they were unsure how to proceed. Second, there were internal memos. These documents showed that United Airlines management had taken the incident seriously enough to conduct an internal investigation. They had interviewed witnesses. They had reviewed security footage, though curiously, no footage of the actual object was ever released or acknowledged to exist. And they had communicated with the FAA about the incident, despite the FAA's initial claims that they had no record of it. The existence of these memos contradicted both United Airlines and the FAA's initial denials. If the incident had not happened, why had United conducted an investigation? If the FAA had no record of it, why had United been communicating with them about it? The paper trail, incomplete as it was made it clear that both organisations had known about the incident from the beginning and had chosen to deny it publicly. Third, and perhaps most significantly, there was evidence that NORAD had been briefly involved. The North American Aerospace Defense Command is responsible for monitoring airspace and responding to potential threats. According to the released documents, someone at O'Hare had contacted NORAD about the object. Intercept protocols had been briefly initiated, and then, without explanation, the alert had been cancelled. This detail raised more questions than it answered. Why would NORAD scramble intercept protocols for a weather phenomenon? Why would they cancel those protocols before any aircraft were actually launched? And why was there no follow-up investigation by military authorities? The released documents were heavily redacted. Large sections were blacked out. Entire pages were withheld on grounds of national security or operational security. But even with these limitations, the documents made one thing abundantly clear. The O'Hare incident had been real. It had been witnessed by credible people. It had been taken seriously by multiple agencies, and then it had been deliberately buried. Investigative journalists attempted to follow up. They contacted NORAD directly. NORAD declined to comment, citing classified protocols. They contacted the Air Force. The Air Force said it had no record of any involvement. They contacted Homeland Security. Homeland Security referred them back to the FAA. The paper trail went in circles. Every agency pointed to another agency. Every official response was either a denial or a referral. And slowly, methodically, the bureaucratic machinery ground the incident down to nothing. No threat, no investigation, no explanation required. One former FAA official, speaking off the record years later, admitted what many had suspected all along. "Of course we tracked it," the official said. "Of course we knew it was there." But once it became clear that it was not a conventional aircraft, and once it became clear that it had left without causing any damage or injuries, the decision was made to classify it as a non-event. Why? Because there was no protocol for dealing with it, no framework, no procedure. It was easier to pretend it had not happened than to try to explain what it was. This unofficial admission confirmed what the witnesses had always believed. The incident had been real. The object had been real, and the cover-up had been deliberate. Act 4. The physical impossibility. In the months and years following the O'Hare incident, aviation experts and physicists began to analyse what the witnesses had described. Their conclusion was unanimous. What had been reported was physically impossible according to every known principle of aerodynamics and propulsion. Commercial pilots were interviewed. They pointed out that no known aircraft can hover motionless without visible means of propulsion. Helicopters use rotors, drones use multiple propellers, Harrier jump jets use directed thrust from their engines. All of these methods produce noise, vibration, and visible signs of their operation. The object at O'Hare had none of these characteristics. Moreover, no known aircraft can accelerate from 0 to supersonic speeds instantaneously. Acceleration requires time. It requires thrust. It requires a visible transition from stationary to motion. The object at O'Hare had exhibited none of this. It had been motionless, and then it had been gone. The witnesses described it as if someone had simply switched it from one state to another, with no intermediary phase. The physics of such an acceleration are staggering to contemplate. If an object 30 feet in diameter and presumably massing several tons were to accelerate from 0 to even subsonic speed instantaneously, the forces involved would be catastrophic. The object itself would need to be constructed from materials that could withstand thousands of times the force of gravity. Any conventional materials, steel, aluminum, titanium, would be torn apart by such forces. And yet the witnesses reported no sound of tearing metal, no explosions, no debris falling from the sky. The object had simply gone from stationary to gone in less time than it takes to blink. The hole in the clouds presented its own set of problems. Meteorologists explained that clouds are not solid. They are composed of tiny water droplets or ice crystals suspended in air. When an object passes through a cloud, the cloud does not tear. It does not leave a clean hole with defined edges. It might create temporary wake or disturbance, but that disturbance dissipates almost immediately. The hole described by the O'Hare witnesses had stayed visible for several minutes, with crisp geometric edges that suggested something far more violent than simple passage through water vapour. One aeronautical engineer, speaking anonymously to a science publication, offered a theory. If an object were to accelerate upward with sufficient speed and force, he said, it could potentially create a shockwave that would temporarily displace the cloud layer. But the energy required to do this would be enormous. We are talking about something that would generate sonic booms, visible contrails, tremendous heat. The witnesses reported none of these things. So whatever caused that hole, it was not conventional propulsion. Boeing engineers were contacted for comment. Most declined. A few, speaking off the record, admitted that they had no explanation for what had been described. One engineer put it bluntly. If someone showed me the specs for an aircraft that could do what those witnesses described, I would tell them it was science fiction. You cannot violate the laws of physics, just because you want to. And what they saw violated just about every law we understand. The radar invisibility was another puzzle. Modern radar systems can detect birds. They can detect weather formations. They can detect small drones at significant distances. The idea that a 30-foot metallic disc could hover over a major airport and leave no radar signature made no sense. Unless, some speculated, the object was made of materials or used technology that could somehow absorb or deflect radar waves. But even this explanation raised more questions than it answered. Such technology, if it existed, would represent a breakthrough so significant that it would revolutionize military aviation. Why would it be flying over a civilian airport in broad daylight? Thomas Wilkins, the mechanic who first spotted the object, gave one final interview several years after the incident. By then, he had retired from United Airlines. He no longer had anything to lose by speaking publicly. His words were measured and careful, but his conviction was absolute. I have worked on aircraft for 30 years, he said. I know what planes look like. I know what helicopters look like. I know what drones look like. What I saw that day was none of those things. It was something else, something I cannot explain. And I think that is what scares people. Not that we saw something strange, but that we saw something we cannot explain. And if we cannot explain it, then we do not understand the world as well as we thought we did. Another witness, a pilot who had seen the object from his cockpit, was even more direct. If it were a drone, he said, we would be flying them by now. If it were some kind of experimental military craft, someone would have come forward. This was not human technology. I do not know what it was, but I know what it was not, and it was not ours. The physics of the incident remained stubbornly unsolvable. Every attempt to explain it using conventional science fell short. Every theory required assumptions that could not be supported by evidence, and so the incident remained exactly what it had been from the beginning, an anomaly, an impossibility, a hole not just in the clouds, but in our understanding of what was possible. Epilogue. The incident that disappeared. More than 15 years have passed since the O'Hare incident. The witnesses have scattered. Some still work in aviation. Others have retired. A few have passed away. But not one of them has recanted their testimony. Not one has admitted to being mistaken or confused. Not one has changed their story. This consistency is remarkable in itself. Human memory is fallible. Eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable over time. Details blur, stories change, people misremember. But the O'Hare witnesses have remained consistent for over 15 years. They all describe the same object, the same behaviour, the same departure, the same hole in the clouds. Their accounts have not drifted or evolved. They have not embellished or exaggerated. They have simply reported year after year what they saw that November afternoon. The official record remains unchanged. The FAA still classifies the incident as weather phenomena. No formal investigation was ever conducted. No radar data was ever released. No explanation was ever provided that satisfactorily addressed the facts as reported by the witnesses. Gate C-17 still operates at O'Hare. Planes still taxi past it every day. Passengers still board flights there, completely unaware that they are standing at the site of one of the most credible UFO sightings in modern history. The airport itself has moved on. The airlines have moved on. The world has moved on. But the questions remain. What was the object that hovered over O'Hare on November 7th, 2006? Where did it come from? Where did it go? Who built it? And perhaps most importantly, why has there been such determined resistance to investigating it seriously? Some argue that the resistance stems from simple bureaucratic inertia. Agencies do not like to investigate things they cannot explain. It creates paperwork. It creates liability. It creates uncomfortable questions from the public and the press. Far easier to dismiss the whole thing and move on. But others point to something deeper. The O'Hare incident represents a challenge to our understanding of reality itself. If we acknowledge that the witnesses saw what they claimed to see, then we must also acknowledge that there are technologies operating in our airspace that we do not understand. Technologies that violate our understanding of physics. Technologies that, by definition, are beyond our current scientific framework. For institutions that pride themselves on control and understanding, this is an intolerable conclusion. Others suggest more sinister explanations. They point to the NORAD involvement. They point to the redacted documents. They point to the quick shutdown of any serious investigation. They argue that the government knows more than it is admitting, that the incident was classified, that the truth is being deliberately withheld. The truth, as always, may be more mundane. Perhaps there was no grand conspiracy. Perhaps there was simply an institutional unwillingness to confront something that did not fit into established categories. Perhaps the cover-up, if it can be called that, was not a deliberate act of secrecy, but rather a reflexive defensive action by organisations that were genuinely unsure how to proceed. The witnesses themselves have varying opinions. Some believe the object was extraterrestrial in origin. Others think it was some kind of classified military technology being tested without proper authorization. A few believe it was something else entirely, something that does not fit into any convenient category. But they all agree on one fundamental point. What they saw was real. It was not a hallucination. It was not a hoax. It was not weather. It was a physical object that defied explanation. And the fact that it has been so thoroughly dismissed, so completely erased from official acknowledgement, troubles them deeply. The broader implications of the O'Hare incident extend beyond the specific events of that November afternoon. It raises questions about how our society handles anomalous events, how we respond when trained professionals report something that contradicts our understanding of what is possible, whether we have systems in place to investigate such events seriously and transparently, and whether we are willing to acknowledge uncertainty rather than retreating into comfortable denials. In an age of increasing surveillance, when cameras are everywhere and data is constantly being recorded, the O'Hare incident stands as a reminder that some things still slip through the gaps, that there are still moments when something extraordinary can occur in full view of multiple witnesses and yet leave behind almost no physical evidence. No photographs that clearly show the object, no video footage that has been released publicly, no radar data that confirms what the witnesses saw, just human testimony. Just people willing to put their credibility on the line to say what they experienced. Janet Thornton, the gate supervisor who witnessed the incident, summed it up in an interview years later. "We are trained to be reliable," she said. "We are trained to be precise. Our jobs depend on our ability to observe accurately and report honestly. And then we report something that does not fit the official narrative, and suddenly we are dismissed as unreliable witnesses. That is what hurts the most. Not that people do not believe what we saw, but that they question our credibility and professionalism because we had the courage to report it." The O'Hare incident remains one of the most well-documented UFO sightings in history. It occurred in broad daylight. It was witnessed by multiple trained professionals. It happened at a major public facility with extensive security and monitoring systems. And yet, officially, it does not exist. It is a non-event, a footnote, a curiosity. But for those who were there, who saw the metallic disc hovering silently above Gate C-17, who watched it shoot straight up through the clouds at impossible speed, who stood there looking at the perfect circular hole it left behind, the incident is anything but a curiosity. It is proof. Proof that there are things in our skies that we do not understand. Proof that our technology, advanced as it may be, is not the most advanced technology. Proof that we are not alone in believing that the universe holds mysteries we have yet to solve. Thomas Wilkins, now in his 70s, still lives in the Chicago area. He rarely talks about the incident anymore. He has told his story so many times that it has become exhausting. But when pressed, when asked if he still believes what he saw was real, his answer is immediate and unwavering. "I know what I saw," he says. "We all know what we saw, and no amount of official denial will change that. It was there. It was real. It was a craft. That word, craft. It appears again and again in the witness statements. Not object, not phenomenon. Craft. A word that implies intention, design, purpose, control. A word that suggests something built by someone, somewhere, for some reason. And so the O'Hare incident remains, not solved, not explained, not officially acknowledged, but remembered, by the witnesses who will carry it with them for the rest of their lives, by the researchers who continue to study it, by the public who finds in it a glimmer of something extraordinary in an increasingly mundane world. On November 7th, 2006, something impossible happened over Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Something that challenged our understanding of physics, aerodynamics, and technology. Something that was witnessed by credible, trained professionals and then systematically erased from official acknowledgement. The hole in the clouds has long since closed, but the hole in our understanding remains, and perhaps that is the real legacy of the O'Hare incident. Not what we saw, but what we still do not know, and what we may never know, unless someday someone decides to tell the truth. The end.
The audio recorder clicked on at exactly 2:47 a.m, December 28, 1980. What it captured over the next 18 minutes would become the most compelling piece of UFO evidence ever recorded. A real-time account of trained military officers watching something impossible unfold in the darkness of an English forest. Now we're observing what appears to be a beam coming down to the ground. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt's voice crackles through the static, calm but edged with disbelief. This is unreal. That recording still exists. You can listen to it right now. And nobody, not the United States Air Force, not the British Ministry of Defence, not any government agency in the 45 years since, has been able to explain what those men witnessed. This is the story of the Rendlesham Forest incident. Every detail is documented, verified, and utterly unexplained. Part 1. The First Night. December 26, 1980, 3 a.m. The night was brutally cold, the kind of damp English winter cold that seeps through multiple layers of clothing and settles into your bones. Staff Sergeant Jim Peniston pulled his jacket tighter as he completed another circuit of the perimeter at Royal Air Force Woodbridge, a United States Air Force installation on the Suffolk coast of England. At 31 years old, Peniston was exactly the kind of man the Air Force wanted guarding its most sensitive assets. Combat trained, clearance certified, and cool under pressure, he'd been stationed at RAF Woodbridge for 3 years. He knew every sound the forest made at night, every pattern of shadows cast by the security lights, every normal flicker of movement in the darkness beyond the fence line. What he saw descending into Rendlesham Forest just after 3 a.m. was none of those things. "We have lights in the forest," Airman First Class John Burrows reported over the radio, his voice steady despite the strangeness of what he was watching. Multiple lights descending. The assumption was immediate and logical: a downed aircraft. The lights had the quality of something burning, something in distress. The forest lay between 2 bases, RAF Woodbridge and RAF Bentwaters, both leased to the US Air Force, both operational, both housing more than just conventional weapons, though that fact remained classified at the time. Peniston, Burrows and Airman Edward Caban-Sag were cleared to investigate on foot. Standard procedure: locate the crash site, secure the area, report back. They'd done similar drills 100 times. Nothing about this night would be standard. The 3 men entered the forest through the east gate, flashlights cutting through the thick darkness between the pines. The lights they'd seen from the base were still visible ahead, though describing them proved difficult. They weren't quite red, weren't quite white. They seemed to pulse and shift, colours bleeding into one another, like nothing any of them had seen before. "Our radio started acting up almost immediately," Peniston would later testify under oath. "Heavy static cutting in and out. We could barely communicate with the base." They pushed deeper into the woods. The temperature seemed to drop further, though that might have been adrenaline, might have been the growing sense that something was deeply wrong about what they were approaching. The lights were close now, impossibly close, and they weren't behaving like any aircraft fire or emergency beacon. Then they saw it. In a clearing roughly 200 metres from the east gate, sitting on or hovering just above the forest floor, was an object unlike anything in their training, their experience, or their understanding of what was possible. It was triangular, approximately 3 metres across at the base, about 2 metres high. Peniston documented in his official statement the next morning, while the details were still sharp and immediate. The surface appeared metallic, but like black glass, smooth and seamless. It was glowing, pulsing, red, blue and white lights moving across the surface, in patterns I couldn't identify. Burrows stood transfixed. It wasn't sitting on the ground, he would later recall. It was hovering, maybe a foot or 2 up, but occasionally it would come down and rest on what looked like legs, 3 of them, triangular landing gear. The object made no sound. Not the roar of engines, not the whine of hydraulics, not even the hum of electrical equipment. In the middle of a forest at night, silence itself becomes a sound. The rustle of branches, the distant call of nocturnal birds, the creak of trees in the wind. But around the craft there was a different quality of silence, as if the air itself had been dampened, muffled. Peniston approached. Every instinct screamed at him to maintain distance, to call for backup, to retreat and observe from a safe position. But his training overrode instinct. His job was to investigate and report. He needed to know what this was. He got within arm's reach. The glow from the craft illuminated his face, his hands, the forest around him, in shifting colours that seemed to come from within the material itself rather than from any external light source. I reached out and touched it, Peniston testified, and this detail, perhaps the most remarkable of that first night, is documented in multiple official statements, cross-referenced and verified. The surface was warm, not hot but warm to the touch, smooth, like glass, but it felt almost soft, like it was absorbing my touch rather than resisting it. What happened next would haunt Peniston for the rest of his life. Along the side of the craft, he noticed markings, symbols, glyphs, pictograms, etched or embedded into the surface. They weren't quite raised, weren't quite recessed, but seemed to exist in the material itself. He traced them with his fingers, trying to make sense of the patterns, trying to commit them to memory. Then something changed in his mind. A flood of information, not words, not images, but pure data. Binary code, ones and zeros streaming through his consciousness at impossible speed. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds, perhaps several minutes. Time became elastic, unreliable. "Peniston, you all right?" Burrows called out, concern sharpening his voice. Peniston stepped back, breaking contact with the craft. The data stream stopped immediately. He stumbled slightly, disoriented, but quickly regained his composure. Yeah, I'm good. I'm documenting this." He pulled out his notebook, standard issue, the kind every security officer carried for logging incidents. With hands that shook slightly, he began sketching the craft, noting dimensions, describing the lights, copying the symbols he'd seen on the hull, as accurately as memory allowed. He recorded the time. 4:45 hours. That notebook still exists. The original pages, written in real time during the encounter, have been examined by document analysts and verified as authentic, written when Peniston claimed they were written. Meanwhile, Burrows circled the clearing, maintaining a perimeter, watching for any change in the situation. Cabansag, positioned further back, kept attempting radio contact with the base, but the interference remained severe. Then, without warning, the craft moved. It lifted silently, rising straight up through the canopy of trees. Except the trees seemed to offer no resistance. The object passed through branches that should have stopped it, should have at least deflected it, but the limbs simply parted or phased through. Within seconds, it had cleared the forest and hovered perhaps 100 feet above the tree line. All three men stood frozen, watching. The pulsing light suddenly brightened, intense enough that they had to shield their eyes. Then the craft shot away, not accelerating gradually like any aircraft or helicopter, but transitioning instantly from stationary to impossible speed. It disappeared toward the eastern horizon in less than 2 seconds. The forest seemed to exhale. Normal sounds returned. Wind through branches, the distant bark of a dog at one of the nearby farms. The radios crackled back to life. "Base, this is Peniston. The lights are gone. Whatever it was, it's gone." The three men stood in the clearing for several minutes more, checking the area with flashlights. The ground where the craft had been showed clear impressions, 3 triangular marks pressed into the frozen soil, forming a perfect triangle, roughly 3 meters apart. Peniston placed his hand in one of the depressions. It was warm. The frost had melted. They marked the location and returned to base as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Part 2. The Aftermath of Night 1. December 26, 1980, morning. By 7 a.m, Staff Sergeant Penniston had filed his official report. Air Force protocol for unusual incidents was clear. Document everything. Report through chain of command. Await further orders. What wasn't clear was what box to check for the type of incident. Aircraft crash, no wreckage, no emergency beacons, no missing aircraft. Security breach, no intruders, no hostile action. Unexplained phenomena? That category existed, but using it meant admitting you'd witnessed something you couldn't explain. Something outside standard military experience. Penniston checked that box anyway. He had no choice. The truth was what mattered. By mid-morning, the team had been dispatched to the clearing with radiation detection equipment. What they found elevated the incident from strange to deeply disturbing. Radiation readings at the 3 depression marks measured between 0.07 and 0.10 milliroentgens, significantly above background radiation for the area. The readings weren't dangerous to humans at that exposure level, but they were measurable, documented, and unexplainable by any conventional source. Tree branches in the direct path of where the craft had risen showed unusual damage, not broken or burned, but bent at angles that suggested they'd been subjected to immense force or heat, yet without any corresponding char marks or splintering. Soil samples were collected, photographs were taken, the area was secured and marked off limits to non-essential personnel. And then something strange happened. Nothing. No press release. No formal investigation announced. The incident was logged, filed and, to all external appearances, forgotten. But inside RAF Woodbridge and the connected base at RAF Bentwaters, the incident was all anyone talked about in low voices during shift changes and in the mess hall. 3 trained security personnel had witnessed something unexplainable. Physical evidence existed, and everyone knew that whatever it was had happened less than a mile from the weapons storage area. The weapons storage area that officially didn't house nuclear weapons, despite every person stationed there knowing exactly what those bunkers contained. Part 3. The Second Night. December 27th to 28th, 1980, 2 a.m. Deputy Base Commander Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt was sceptical. At 44 years old and 22 years into his Air Force career, he'd heard plenty of strange stories from young airmen. Most had prosaic explanations: misidentified aircraft, unusual weather phenomena, the lighthouse at Orford Ness creating optical illusions through the trees. But the physical evidence from the first night was harder to dismiss. Radiation readings, ground depressions, multiple witnesses filing consistent reports. And now, 24 hours later, his security teams were reporting lights in the forest again. Holt made a decision that would create one of the most important historical documents in UFO research. He grabbed a portable audio recorder. "I'm going out there myself," he told his staff. "If something's happening, we're going to document it properly." He assembled a team of 8 men, including 2 senior officers, and headed into Rendlesham Forest at approximately 2 a.m. The audio recorder was running from the moment they left the base. The recording, now known simply as the Holt tape, captures what happens next. At first there's the crunch of boots on frozen ground, low conversations as the team navigates through the darkness. Holt's voice, calm and methodical, describes their position and heading. Then at 2:47 hours, everything changes. "We're approaching the clearing now," Holt narrates. "I can see there's a light ahead, moving through the trees." The team advances cautiously. In the recording, you can hear the uncertainty in their movements, the way their voices tighten slightly, despite their training and discipline. "Wait, stop," one of the officers says. "Look at that." "I see it," Holt confirms. "There's a glowing object in the clearing. Appears to be... it's It's got a bright red core like a burning eye, and there's blue lights. No, wait, they're moving. The lights are moving around it. The object Holt describes doesn't match what Penniston saw the previous night. This seems larger, more fluid in its appearance. The lights pulse and dance around a central core of deep red luminescence. Are those beams? Someone asks, their voice tight with awe or fear. It's hard to tell which. Affirmative, Holt replies. We're observing what appears to be a beam coming down to the ground. This is unreal. The team watches, documenting everything verbally. The object seems to be scanning the area, sending down focused beams of light that illuminate patches of forest floor with stark white intensity. It's moving, Holt continues. Object is splitting into multiple lights now. 5 distinct lights. No, 6. They're moving independently through the trees. The recording captures confusion, amazement, and the absolute strangeness of trained military officers struggling to describe something that defies description. The lights move in ways that violate physics as they understand it, stopping instantly, changing direction without deceleration, passing through solid objects. Then comes the moment that still sends chills down the spines of everyone who listens to the recording. One of the objects is coming toward us, Holt says, his voice finally showing an edge of tension. It's beaming light down. The beam it's on the ground in front of us, maybe 50 feet away. There's a pause, heavy breathing, the sound of men moving, possibly backing away. Sir, is it scanning us? One of the airmen asks. I don't know. Just maintain position and keep documenting. The light moves closer. In the recording you can hear the fear creeping into their voices, though they maintain discipline. These are men trained for combat, men who've faced real danger, but this is something beyond their frame of reference. It's directly overhead now, Holt says, his voice quieter, more controlled, the tone of a man forcing himself to stay calm. Beam is moving. It's pointing toward the base, toward Bentwaters, toward the weapons storage area. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. If this craft, whatever it is, whoever built it, is interested in the nuclear weapons, then this is no longer just a strange occurrence. This is a potential security crisis of the highest order. The beam holds for approximately 30 seconds, then retracts. The lights begin to move away, back through the forest, still moving in those impossible patterns that suggest either technology far beyond human capability or a fundamental misunderstanding of what they're actually witnessing. Object is departing to the east, Holt records. Multiple lights still visible. Speed is... I can't estimate the speed. It's moving too fast. The lights vanish into the distance, leaving the team standing in the darkness of the forest. The normalcy of the night slowly seeping back around them. The recording continues for several more minutes as Holt documents the immediate aftermath, checking the locations where the beams had touched down, taking radiation readings, which again show elevated levels, marking positions for the formal report he knows he'll have to write. When the team returns to base at approximately 4:30 a.m, Holt has nearly 18 minutes of audio documentation. The tape will be transcribed, analysed and studied for decades. Every word on it is verifiable, every voice identified, every claim cross-referenced with the written reports filed afterward. No one has ever been able to explain what those men witnessed and recorded that night. Part 4. The Official Response. January 13th, 1981. Lieutenant Colonel Holt sat at his desk, staring at the memo he'd just finished typing. It was addressed to the Ministry of Defence, United Kingdom, a diplomatic necessity since the incident had occurred on British soil, even if it was at a US Air Force installation. The memo was titled Unexplained Lights. He read through it one more time, checking each detail against the reports from Penniston, Burrows and the other witnesses, cross-referencing with his own audio recording and observations. The document was concise, professional, and utterly extraordinary. Early in the morning of 27th of December 80, approximately 0300L, 2 USAF security police patrolmen saw unusual lights outside the back gate at RAF Woodbridge. Thinking an aircraft might have crashed or been forced down, they called for permission to go outside the gate to investigate. The on-duty flight chief responded and allowed 3 patrolmen to proceed on foot. The individuals reported seeing a strange glowing object in the forest. The object was described as being metallic in appearance and triangular in shape, approximately 2 to 3 metres across the base and approximately 2 metres high. It illuminated the entire forest with a white light. The object itself had a pulsing red light on top and a bank of blue lights underneath. The object was hovering or on legs. As the patrolman approached the object, it manoeuvred through the trees and disappeared. At this time, the animals on a nearby farm went into a frenzy. The object was briefly sighted approximately an hour later near the back gate. The memo continued with details from the second night, his own observations, the radiation readings, the physical depressions in the ground. The following night, 29th of December 80, the area was checked for radiation. Beta/gamma readings of 0.1 milliroentgens were recorded with peak readings in the 3 depressions and near the centre of the triangle formed by the depressions. A nearby tree had moderate IRO 5 to MO 7 readings on the side of the tree toward the depressions. Finally, he described what he'd personally witnessed. Later in the night, a red sun-like light was seen through the trees. It moved about and pulsed. At one point, it appeared to throw off glowing particles, and then broke into 5 separate white objects, and then disappeared. Immediately thereafter, 3 star-like objects were noticed in the sky, 2 objects to the north and 1 to the south, all of which were about 10 degrees off the horizon. The objects moved rapidly in sharp angular movements and displayed red, green and blue lights. The objects to the north appeared to be elliptical through an 8 to 12 power lens. They then turned to full circles. The objects to the north remained in the sky for an hour or more. The object to the south was visible for 2 or 3 hours and beamed down a stream of light from time to time. Numerous individuals, including the undersigned, witnessed the activities in paragraphs 2 and 3. Holt signed the memo and sent it through official channels to the Ministry of Defence. The response, when it came, was brief and dismissive. The events described are of no defence significance. That single line would define the official position for the next 2 decades. Despite multiple witnesses, physical evidence, audio documentation, and radiation readings, the Ministry of Defence determined the incident required no further investigation, but that wasn't quite the end of the official response. In 2001, under the Freedom of Information Act, previously classified correspondence was released. Internal MOD documents revealed significant concern at high levels, questions about why American personnel were investigating what appeared to be an aerospace intrusion on British territory, discussions about whether the RAF should conduct its own investigation, debates about whether to involve intelligence services. The public dismissal and private concern didn't match. Something about the Rendlesham incident had troubled officials enough to generate significant internal discussion, even as they maintained publicly that nothing significant had occurred. Part 5. The Years of Silence. 1981 to 1994. For more than a decade, the Rendlesham Forest incident remained largely unknown outside military circles. Penniston, Burroughs and the other witnesses returned to their regular duties, though what they'd experienced continued to affect them in ways both subtle and profound. Penniston couldn't shake the memory of touching the craft, of that strange data stream that had flooded his mind. In the months following the incident, he began having vivid dreams, not nightmares exactly, but intense sequences of binary codes scrolling through his consciousness while he slept. He started writing them down, page after page of ones and zeros, transcribed in the middle of the night when the dreams became too vivid to ignore. He didn't understand what they meant or why he felt compelled to record them, but the urge was overwhelming. He filled an entire notebook with binary sequences, then locked it away. The incident had already marked his career in subtle ways. He was still respected, still trusted, but there was an unspoken acknowledgement that he was the officer who touched a UFO. In military culture, where conformity and reliability are paramount, being associated with the unexplained was not career-enhancing. Burroughs struggled differently. He'd been closest to the craft during that first night, had stood in its presence for longer than the others. In the years following, he developed health problems, heart issues, immune system complications that military physicians couldn't fully explain. When he filed for Veterans Affairs benefits related to his service, he encountered a strange problem. His military medical records from the Rendlesham period were incomplete, with significant gaps in documentation. It was as if certain files had been removed or reclassified. Meanwhile, the physical evidence from the forest remained in government hands. The radiation readings, soil samples, photographs, all filed away in classified archives, inaccessible to civilian researchers or even most military personnel. But the story couldn't stay buried forever. In 1983, a copy of Holt's memo to the Ministry of Defence was leaked to an American UFO research organisation. The document's authenticity was quickly verified, and suddenly the Rendlesham Forest incident became public knowledge. News crews descended on Suffolk. Journalists interviewed locals who reported their own strange sightings during that period. Lights in the sky, unusual aircraft movements, military personnel acting strangely secretive in the days following the incident. Penniston, Burroughs and Holt were approached for interviews. Initially, they declined, citing military protocol and their ongoing service obligations. But as years passed and they left active duty, their willingness to discuss the incident grew. Part 6. The Binary Code Revelation. 2010. Jim Penniston, now retired and 61 years old, made a decision that would add another layer of strangeness to an already incomprehensible event. He released the notebook, the one he'd filled with binary code in the months following the incident, the sequences he'd transcribed from dreams and compulsive waking episodes, the data he couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. "I know how this sounds," he said during a press conference, holding up the worn notebook. "I know the skepticism this will generate, but I also know what happened to me when I touched that craft. Something was downloaded into my mind. For 30 years I've tried to understand what it means." He enlisted the help of computer specialists and cryptographers. The binary sequences were analysed, processed through various decoding algorithms. What emerged was startling. Large portions of the binary translated into readable English text. Exploration of humanity, continuous for planetary advance. Origin, year 8100. Even more remarkably, embedded in the sequences were precise geographical coordinates. When mapped, they corresponded to 7 locations of significant archaeological importance. The Nazca Lines in Peru, the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt, Sedona, Arizona, the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, Greece, the Pyramids of Tikal in Guatemala, Taishan, Sacred Mountain in China, Porta de Hayu Marca, Gate of the Gods in Peru. The implications were extraordinary. These were sites of ancient human civilization, locations that predated modern technology by thousands of years. Yet here they were, encoded in a binary message allegedly transmitted by a craft witnessed by US Air Force personnel in 1980. The skeptical response was immediate and predictable. Why did this revelation come 30 years after the fact? Why not report the binary code immediately? How convenient that it couldn't be verified through contemporary documentation. But Penniston had an answer to at least one of those challenges. He produced his original notebook from December 26th, 1980, the one he'd filled while standing in the forest, immediately after the encounter. The sketches of the craft, the timeline of events, the symbols he'd copied from the hull. Document analysts examined it. The paper was consistent with standard military-issue notebooks from 1980. The ink composition matched pens available at that time. Most importantly, embedded in his notes from that night, in tiny script at the bottom of one page, were sequences of binary digits. Not the full message, just fragments, dozens of ones and zeros scattered among his other observations. At the time, they'd seemed like random data, meaningless artifacts of his confused mental state. But now, 3 decades later, they matched the beginning sequences of the longer message he'd transcribed in the following months. The binary code had been there all along, documented in real time, just unrecognised for what it was. Part 7. The Cold War Context. The hidden layer. To understand why the Rendlesham incident carries such weight, you must understand what wasn't publicly acknowledged at the time. Both RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge housed American nuclear weapons. This was officially denied throughout the Cold War. The US and UK governments maintained careful ambiguity about nuclear deployments, citing security concerns and diplomatic sensitivities. But everyone stationed at those bases knew the truth. The security protocols, the restricted areas, the weapons storage bunkers, with their distinctive designs, all pointed to one conclusion. It wasn't until decades later that NATO declassified documents confirmed what had been an open secret. American tactical nuclear weapons were indeed stored at multiple RAF installations in the UK, including Bentwaters. This context transforms the Rendlesham incident from a strange encounter into something more disturbing. When Charles Holt recorded that beam of light pointing toward the weapons storage area, he was documenting something extraordinary. An unknown craft, apparently under intelligent control, specifically focusing attention on one of America's nuclear arsenals during the height of Cold War tensions. This wasn't the first time UFOs had been associated with nuclear facilities. Similar incidents had been reported at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, 1967, where multiple nuclear missiles went offline during a UFO sighting. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming, multiple incidents throughout the 1960s and 70s. Loring Air Force Base in Maine, 1975, where unknown aircraft penetrated restricted airspace over weapons storage areas. But Rendlesham was different because of the documentation, the audio recording, the written reports, the multiple witnesses. This wasn't second-hand testimony or disputed recollections. This was real-time documentation of an unknown craft demonstrating interest in nuclear weapons. The question that haunts military strategists and security analysts: was the craft merely observing, or was it capable of interfering with the weapons themselves? Former launch officers from other nuclear installations have come forward in recent years with disturbing accounts of UFO encounters that coincided with temporary weapon systems failures. During the Malmstrom incident, All 10 nuclear missiles in one flight went into no-go status, completely offline, while security personnel watched a glowing object hover over the facility. Did something similar happen at Rendlesham? The official documents don't address this question directly, but the inference is chilling. Whoever or whatever was controlling that craft had access to, and possibly influence over, some of the most secure and heavily guarded weapons in the American military. Part 8. The physical evidence. What remains verified? 45 years after the incident, what can we say with certainty? The witnesses, multiple trained US Air Force personnel, including command-level officers, all filed official statements, all have maintained their accounts consistently over decades. Several have undergone polygraph examinations and passed. None have recanted or significantly changed their stories. The documentation of Charles Holt's audio recording, publicly available, verified authentic. Holt's memo to the Ministry of Defence, released via FOIA, confirmed official. Peniston's original notebook from December 26, 1980, examined and authenticated. Multiple witness statements filed through official military channels. MOD correspondence showing internal government concern. The physical evidence radiation readings taken at the site, documented in official reports. Ground depressions forming a triangular pattern, photographed and measured. Tree damage consistent with exposure to extreme heat or force. Soil samples collected, though results remain classified. What we don't have any conventional explanation that accounts for all the documented observations. Government acknowledgement of what the object was, access to all relevant classified materials, some files remain restricted, a definitive answer to what occurred those nights. The frustration for researchers is that the evidence is simultaneously compelling and incomplete. There's enough documentation to confirm something extraordinary happened, but not enough transparency to determine exactly what. Part 9. The skeptical explanations. Attempting rational analysis. Over the decades, multiple explanations have been proposed for what the Rendlesham witnesses experienced. The lighthouse theory. The Orford Ness Lighthouse, located several miles from the forest, emits a bright beam that sweeps across the landscape. Skeptics suggest the witnesses misidentified this familiar light source, possibly in combination with atmospheric conditions or stress. Problems with this theory. All witnesses were familiar with the lighthouse. They'd been stationed there for years. The lights described moved in patterns inconsistent with a fixed beacon. The lighthouse doesn't explain the physical ground traces or radiation readings. Holt's audio recording captures lights moving through the trees, not a distant fixed beam. The meteor theory. An unusual meteor shower or bolide entering the atmosphere could have created bright lights and unusual visual effects. Problems with this theory. Meteors don't hover or land. The encounters lasted too long for meteor phenomena. No meteor activity was recorded by astronomical observers that would match the described events. Meteors don't explain the craft, Peniston described touching. The prank theory. Some have suggested local individuals created an elaborate hoax using lights, props, or other deceptive methods. Problems with this theory. How would pranksters penetrate security at a military installation during the Cold War? How would they create radiation anomalies and ground traces? Why would trained security personnel be fooled by conventional props? The theory requires a conspiracy of witnesses to misrepresent what they saw. The psychological explanation. Mass hysteria, sleep deprivation, or misidentification of ordinary stimuli, creating extraordinary perceptions. Problems with this theory. The witnesses were combat-trained professionals. The incidents occurred on different nights, with different personnel. Physical evidence contradicts purely psychological explanations. Multiple witnesses across multiple incidents reported similar observations independently. None of these explanations adequately account for all the documented evidence. Each addresses one or two aspects of the incident while failing to explain others. Part 10. Where it stands today. The unresolved mystery. In 2020, exactly 40 years after the incident, researcher Gary Hesseltine filed a Freedom of Information request with the US Air Force regarding satellite downlink data from December 1980 that might have covered the Rendlesham Forest area. The response was intriguing and frustrating in equal measure. A satellite downlink matching the time and location parameters did exist, but the data file had been deleted in 1981 due to server migration and storage limitations. The timing of that deletion, less than 1 month after the incident, struck researchers as suspicious. Whether it was routine data management or something more deliberate remains unknown. Jim Penniston and John Burroughs, now in their 70s, occasionally appear together at conferences and events. They remain friends, bonded by an experience that marked them both permanently. People ask me if I think it was extraterrestrial, Penniston said in a 2019 interview. I tell them I don't know. I don't have enough information to make that determination. What I do know is this: it was technology beyond anything we had in 1980. It demonstrated capabilities that still seem impossible, and whoever controlled it knew exactly where our nuclear weapons were stored. Burroughs finally received medical benefits from the Veterans Affairs Department in 2015 after a long legal battle. Unusually, the VA determination letter stated his health issues were service-connected, but cited classified information that couldn't be disclosed even to Burroughs himself. It was an admission that something happened to him during his military service that affected his health, but what that something was remains officially obscure. Charles Holt, now in his 80s and retired, has become more outspoken about the incident in recent years. He's testified before citizen panels, appeared in numerous documentaries, and consistently maintained that what he witnessed and recorded was genuine, unexplained, and significant. I'm not a UFO enthusiast, he said in one interview. I'm a retired military officer telling you what I saw, what I documented, and what remains unexplained. The audio tape is real. The memo is real. The witnesses are real. Whatever we encountered in those woods was real. That's not speculation, that's documented fact. Epilogue. The questions that remain. The Rendlesham Forest incident stands as one of the most thoroughly documented, unexplained events in modern history. Unlike many UFO cases that rely on distant lights or ambiguous observations, Rendlesham offers close-range observations by multiple trained witnesses, physical trace evidence, real-time audio documentation, official military reports through proper channels, decades of consistent testimony. Yet despite all this documentation, we're no closer to a definitive answer than we were in 1980. The questions persist. What was the craft that Penniston touched? If human-made, whose technology was it? And why was it testing near American nuclear weapons? If not human-made, what were the intentions of whoever controlled it? Why did the binary code contain coordinates to ancient human sites? Was this merely an elaborate confabulation by Penniston, or does it suggest something more complex about the nature of the encounter? What happened to the classified files? Why do gaps exist in medical records? Why was satellite data deleted? What remains hidden in government archives? Why the official dismissal? If the incident was truly of no defence significance. Why did internal government documents show such concern? Why were high-level officials asking questions they never answered publicly? What about the beam directed at the weapons storage area? Was it scanning, disabling, simply observing? The witnesses saw it happen, but what did it mean? These questions may never have satisfactory answers. The governments involved have shown no interest in reopening investigations. Files remain classified or destroyed. The witnesses are aging, and with time, living memory of the event will fade. But the evidence remains. You can listen to the Holt tape right now. 18 minutes of a military officer documenting the impossible in real time. You can read the official memo, stamped and signed. You can examine Peniston's notebook, written in the darkness of that forest, while his hands still tingled from touching something beyond his comprehension. The Rendlesham Forest incident refuses to be dismissed or explained away. It stands in that uncomfortable space between the documented and the understood, between the witnessed and the believed. In the end, perhaps the most important aspect of Rendlesham isn't what we know, but what we cannot deny. Something happened in those woods in December 1980. Multiple trained observers saw it, touched it, recorded it, and documented it through official channels. The evidence exists, verified and unexplained. Whether it was extraterrestrial visitors, classified human technology, or something else entirely, one truth remains certain. On those cold winter nights, in an English forest, near America's nuclear weapons, something impossible became real. And 45 years later, we still don't know what it was. Jim Peniston lives quietly in Arizona, occasionally speaking about his experience, but largely keeping to himself. The binary code notebook sits in a secure location, examined by researchers, but never fully explained. John Burroughs continues to deal with health complications related to his service. He's become an advocate for other military witnesses who've encountered unexplained phenomena, urging the government to declassify information that might help them understand what they experienced. Charles Holt remains the most vocal of the witnesses. Now in his mid-80s, he travels occasionally to share his story, always bringing copies of the original documents, always playing the audio tape, always ending with the same statement. I know what I saw, I know what we documented, and I know it's never been explained. Edward Cabansag, who witnessed the first night from a distance, largely stayed out of the spotlight, but has confirmed the accounts of Peniston and Burroughs in official statements. The other personnel who witnessed the second night have mostly remained anonymous, but several have provided testimony supporting Holt's account. The forest itself remains. The trees have grown. The precise landing site is now difficult to locate without coordinates, but the woods are still there between the two former air bases. RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge were returned to British control in 1993 and eventually closed. The weapons storage area is now just empty concrete bunkers, its nuclear secrets declassified and relocated. But on cold December nights, locals still report seeing lights in the forest. Whether these are echoes of the past, continuing phenomena, or simply the power of suggestion, no one can say for certain. The Rendlesham Forest incident endures as Britain's Roswell, a case built not on crashed wreckage or blurry photographs, but on the steady, documented testimony of military personnel who encountered something that changed their understanding of what's possible. They saw something impossible. They documented it, and after 45 years no one has been able to explain it away.